Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. Now everybody is playing the new cards and the new decks that were released from Spacetime Smackdown. Things like Darkrai, things like Palkia, things like Dialga. Those cards and those decks are really fun and they're really strong. However, what we saw in this past weekend of competition was that things like Charizard and Gyarados actually ended up placing higher than any other deck in the format, any of the other new decks. And I think a big reason for that was also people weren't really necessarily accounting for some of the strongest cards of the previous formats, but also these decks and these old Pokemon that, again, were out in either Genetic Apex or Mythical Island are actually a lot better now due to some inclusions that we got from Spacetime Smackdown. So in this video, we're going to take a look at all of the updated and upgraded old decks that we played in previous formats that are still top tier decks right now in the format. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about Charizard EX. I think probably the best example of this. Before we move into the video though, don't forget to like and subscribe. We're almost at 10,000 subscribers, which is actually absolutely insane. I never thought that we would get there, but we're almost there, and the support has been phenomenal over the last few weeks, so I really do appreciate it. If you guys enjoy the videos and you're not subscribed, definitely subscribe. It means a lot to me, and it's going to help out the channel a lot. Okay. So let's get into Charizard and why Charizard EX is so much better now. So before Charizard EX in previous formats, we didn't have things like Pokemon Communications, which is an incredible consistency card and makes really any deck that plays evolution Pokemon in it much more consistent than it otherwise was previously. Now, back in the day, or in previous formats, I say back in the day, but really just a couple months ago in Genetic Apex and in Mythical Island, we were playing Charizard probably with Arcanine and maybe some other Pokemon to just kind of guarantee at least that at some point in the match we had some Pokemon that we could attack with. This made Charizard not very consistent, but it made it very volatile, where yes, if we drew all the right cards that we wanted to, we were extremely powerful. Charizard is literally still to this day the strongest Pokemon in the entire game, doing 200 damage. So the upside to Charizard has always been phenomenal, but it's had low consistency. So its overall win rates oftentimes haven't been great in tournaments, but it always kind of places pretty high on the standings, because at least, someone, rather, out of a large sample size of people playing Charizard, is going to get lucky. Now, the difference now with Charizard is we don't have to play a bunch of different Pokemon and hope that we draw into something. Now we can actually minimize the amount of Pokemon that we're playing in the deck, which actually makes it that much more consistent. Only playing two basic Pokemon in Charmander and Moltres gives us a 50-50 chance to lead off with Moltres EX, which is, of course, what we want to do with Charizard. Moltres wants to be that first Pokemon in the active spot as early as possible, so minimizing the amount of basic Pokemon in the deck increases the odds that we do start with Moltres. But now, because we're running less Pokemon in general, Pokemon Communications, which if you don't know is a item card that allows us to swap a Pokemon from our hand with a random Pokemon from our deck. This includes evolution Pokemon. So in a deck like this, where we're running only 4 basics and 4 evolution Pokemon, we can thin out those basic Pokemon from our deck, either just by drawing into them or starting with one, which we always do, or playing Pokeballs, that way leaving only really evolution Pokemon in our deck, which is almost a guaranteed pull off of Pokemon Communications. Makes Charizard so much more consistent than it otherwise was. And in general, I just think that Charizard has gotten a massive consistency buff, which is actually really terrifying for the rest of the format, considering how strong Charizard EX always was and still is. 200 damage is going to KO anything in the game right now. So we really have to account for Charizard. Luckily, there is a hard counter to this card, which is, of course, Mew EX, which didn't see a lot of play in this first week of competition, but it is really the one hard counter card to Charizard EX. For 3 energies, we can revenge KO for 200 damage. But let's talk about some other inclusions here. So Potion is more of a tech card. It's not a new card, but in this format right now, with all of those, Greninja, Darkrai, Druddigon decks kind of floating around, Potion is a really good option to kind of negate some of that early game chip damage, and really allow us to kind of, save some time or some extra early turns, basically, by negating some of that chip damage. So I think it's a good inclusion in Charizard right now. Probably meant to be used with Moltres early in the game, but we also have Giant Cape, which is pretty important because it does bring Moltres up to 160 HP. Previously, I forgot that Moltres was weak to electric type Pokemon, so it's not necessarily the biggest deal in the world, but we do have things that hit for 150. Mewtwo does still exist, Palkia does still exist, and even things like Gyarados hit for 140. So being able to bring Moltres up to 160 HP is really important, and I think that's why one Giant Cape in Charizard is much more useful than it otherwise was. We could even technically attach that Giant Cape to Charizard to go up to 200 HP, maybe live 2 or 3 attacks from an opposing Pokemon. It's just a really good inclusion in most decks right now. But either way, I would say that Pokemon Communications really is the big difference here. It allows us to get into Charizard much more consistently, and now really all we have to do is hopefully start with the Moltres, which again it's pretty high. It's a 50-50% chance, so pretty good odds there. As good as it really can be, honestly. And then, just flip heads, basically, with Inferno Dance, which I know, I mean, sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't, but either way, Charizard was always very, very strong, and now it's even more consistent than it ever was before because of Pokemon communication. So, Pokecom is good in almost really any deck that plays, not even evolution Pokemon, just really any deck in general, that plays a lot of different Pokemon, specifically definitely good in decks with evolution Pokemon, but particularly decks that aren't running a ton of Pokemon, right? So if you're running a couple basics and a couple evolution Pokemon, Pokecom is just that much better, making so many decks so much more consistent. Charizard going to be one of the strongest decks of this format, in my opinion. I have it in the S tier right now. I just don't think we're going to have to account for it because it could just absolutely run away and dominate this particular format. So we'll have to see how things pan out. But let's move on to the next deck list here to talk about, which is going to be Pikachu EX. So Pikachu is really interesting right now. I think that it actually got considerably buffed in a lot of different ways. It didn't see a massive amount of representation here in the first week of competition. Again, a lot of people kind of choosing to play some of the other new cards other than Pachirisu. There was a Pachirisu deck that ran 18 trainer cards, which again, was a pretty good deck in its own right, but we're talking about Pikachu today, particularly the Pikachu and Zapdos combination. So this list here ended up getting or making top cut at the recent 1800 player Ursa Days tournament this past weekend, and there are some very interesting interactions here. The more I look at this deck, the more I absolutely love it, and there's a lot of reasons for this. So Pikachu EX, still one of the most consistent tempo attackers in the game. 80 damage, or 90 damage rather, on your second turn is extremely good, or Pachirisu doing 80 damage on your second turn. Both very, very consistent early game attacking options. And of course, we have Zapdos EX, which can peck for 20 damage early in the match. That is going to allow us to one-hit KO a Magikarp if it's stuck in the active spot, which can be good. We also have an Electabuzz to allow us to also, snipe a Magikarp on the bench if needed. Now, there's a lot here to talk about. So first and foremost, I'm going to talk about the inclusion of Pachirisu in Pikachu decks. Pachirisu and Pikachu are very similar, so at first glance, it might not make a lot of sense as to why we would run both of these cards in the same deck. But the thing that you got to think about is that any Pikachu deck is primarily focused around Pikachu because it's so consistent and so powerful. So practically in a deck like this, we're able to run, practically speaking, we're basically running 4 copies of Pikachu EX, which is absurdly consistent. They are different. Like I said, of course, Pikachu needs benched Pokemon to do that damage. Pachirisu needs tool cards to do this to do its damage. But either way, they're very, very similar cards in how they function. In this deck, we are running the 2 new tool cards, which are really good inclusions either way. Rocky Helmet and Giant Cape are both really, really good. You might be wondering why we're running Rocky Helmet, 2 copies of that and not 2 copies of Giant Cape. In my opinion, that extra damage that we take from Rocky Helmet is actually more substantial than increasing our HP up to 140 or 150 with Zapdos. I think Rocky Helmet is really good in aggro decks, not just, tanky, sort of bulky decks with things like Exeggutor or Druddigon decks. It's actually really good in aggro decks as well. Again, you got to think that no matter what, our opponent is probably attacking us, 2, 3, or maybe 4 times in a match in order to win, and that adds up. That's 60 or 80 extra damage that we're doing to our opponent, and it really can be the difference. So in aggro-based decks, Rocky Helmet is actually pretty substantial, and like I said, we have to run tool cards with Pachirisu, so I think Rocky Helmet is a really good inclusion to this deck. Again, just more damage in the early to mid game is that much better. Basically, our opponent has to KO us, so no matter what, they're going to take damage from Rocky Helmet, and any damage modifiers in a deck like this, I think, is really, really good. It's also 20 damage. Like, Rocky Helmet is literally better than Giovanni. It's a better card, which is just funny to think because it's not a supporter card. The other thing that we have to talk about, and another thing that I actually really, really love, that I think is a massive buff to these Pikachu decks, is the Dawn and Zapdos combination. So Zapdos was always a very unreliable attacker, but a very explosive basic Pokemon that could potentially one-hit KO basically anything in the game. You flip 4 coins, maybe you do 50 damage, maybe you do 200 damage. Either way, it's a very unpredictable, but either way, a very powerful attack with Zapdos. However, 3 energies was kind of tough. There wasn't really a way to get those energies on Zapdos other than, manually attaching to Zapdos. However, that's not the case anymore. Now we have Dawn. So in a scenario basically where if we're attaching to Pikachu EX and we attack for Circle Circuit turn 1, or maybe we're just kind of attaching, energies to any of our bench Pokemon, now what we're able to do is play X-Speed because every Pokemon in our deck has a retreat cost of 1. This is an upside. We can retreat out for free with X-Speed and then actually move that energy from one of our bench Pokemon to Zapdos, effectively putting 2 energies onto it in 1 turn. basically kind of allowing us to attack with Zapdos much more consistently and not have to manually attach those 3 energies to Zapdos. It's a very important combination here, and I think it allows us to utilize Zapdos a lot more commonly and a lot more effectively and a lot more consistently, which I do think that Dawn is buffing Zapdos a very significant degree. Now, this is again a version of Pikachu, because Pikachu is an old deck, Pikachu Zapdos, the classic combo. I think this is probably one of the better ways to play it right now, and I do think that it got a sizable buff. However, Zapdos in its own right is very interesting. Technically, you could play the Magneton card, the Magnezone line, and then basically what you can do in a deck like that is technically you can attack for Thundering Hurricane on turn 2, or turn 2 or turn 3, whatever your second attachment turn is, because we can evolve into Magneton on our second turn. On turn 1, if we're going second, like I said, we can attach to Zapdos, and then we can accelerate that energy to Magneton, move that energy with Dawn to Zapdos, and then attach on our turn 2 to Zapdos, and bam, by our second turn, if we're going second, that is, we can attack for Thundering Hurricane. So that combination actually could be really interesting. I have to test it in my own right, but I think that Dawn has buffed Zapdos in many, many different ways. We saw Lieutenant Surge see play, and Dawn is a very similar card to Lieutenant Surge. In fact, it actually works for all Pokemon, not just Raichus or Electabuzz cards. So it's very interesting to that degree, but I do think that the Dawn and Zapdos combination, as well as Cyrus, like I said, because we are able to do some bench damage with Electabuzz. Cyrus just a little bit more of a consistent, Gust card, as opposed to Sabrina. Late in the game, there's a lot of times maybe where we're not taking one-hit KOs with this deck, right? We're doing, smaller amounts of damage, which is actually a scenario where Cyrus is a bit better, right? Because a lot of the matchups here with Pikachu were maybe attacking the active Pokemon for a bit, and then maybe they retreat out into their attacking Pokemon, and now we can bring that Pokemon that we damaged previously earlier in the game with Cyrus to the active spot to finish that KO, potentially winning the game. Very good win condition. I think Cyrus is really good in really most aggro decks. Probably better than Sabrina in most scenarios there, even if we're not doing particularly a lot of bench damage. So I really like this deck. Now, Gyarados is pretty dominant. We're going to take a look at Gyarados in this video. Gyarados still very, very dominant, and we're not playing Zebstrika, so our ability to KO Magikarps is a little bit less consistent with this deck because, again, Electabuzz is a basic Pokemon, but it requires 2 energies. But either way, I think the really bread and butter combination of this deck is the consistency that's added by adding Pachirisu, and as well as a much more consistent, powerful attacking option in Zapdos EX being buffed by Dawn. And like I said, Rocky Helmet and Giant Cape, both just really good cards in most decks. In fact, I think that on top of Pokemon Communications, things like Rocky Helmet and Giant Cape are very, very meta defining, and I think that they've shaped this meta much more differently than it otherwise would have been if those cards weren't included. But either way, updated Pikachu, we'll have to see exactly what the best way to play Pikachu is. But like I said, I think Pachirisu is a good card, and I think Zapdos is even better now with Dawn. I really love this combination in this combo. So let's move on here and talk about Gyarados. So I wanted to include Gyarados in this deck or in this video, but the thing is, Gyarados really hasn't changed at all. Like, there's not a lot of room in the deck anyway. We're running a lot of Pokemon still. Yes, you could play Pokemon Communications in this deck, but that way, if we're playing Pokemon, we would have to cut things like Leaf. We'd have to cut maybe like a Cyrus or Misty's. And basically, I think that the only thing we changed with Gyarados is we swapped out Sabrina for Cyrus. And this is actually a very, very, very big deal. I think that Cyrus actually makes Gyarados much better than it otherwise was before. The main reason for this is because Cyrus has incredible synergy with Greninja. Basically, we can target a benched Pokemon not only for 20 damage, but also to bring them up into the active spot, right? So Greninja being able to do benched damage damage to a bench Pokemon, and then allowing us to bring it right up into the active spot with Cyrus is exceptionally strong. So basically, we can kind of hunt KOs. The 140 from Gyarados plus the 20 from Greninja is enough to KO basically any Pokemon in the game. And basically, our ability to bring that Pokemon up to the active spot whenever we want with Cyrus is exceptionally strong. Plus the chip damage that we're doing with Druddigon. There's a lot of synergy between Druddigon, Cyrus, and Greninja altogether. But other than that, I don't really think there's much we need to change about Gyarados. It's still inherently, I would say, the strongest card in the entire game. It's just so overtuned. Like Charizard inherently is stronger, but it's a stage 2 Pokemon. Gyarados has 180 HP, which is the same as Charizard, and it hits for 140, which is less, of course, but again, we have a lot of ramping ability in water type decks with Misty's. So I don't know, like Charizard and Gyarados are two of the strongest Pokemon in the game. There are hard counters to them. Like I said, Hitmonlee can snipe the Magikarp. Zipstrika can snipe the Magikarp. We could play Giant Cape in a deck like this and preemptively attach it to Magikarp. Could protect you in some scenarios. So Gyarados decks might change a little bit depending on how the meta changes and formulates around Gyarados. Similar to Charizard, right? We can, maybe change our deck around a little bit depending on if a lot of people are starting to play Mew EX. But for now, basically, Gyarados and Charizard, two of the strongest cards in the game. People weren't really accounting for these decks early on in this format in the first week of competition. So what it ended up being was just Gyarados and Charizard really dominating the top tables. Gyarados still one of the strongest decks in the game. Druddigon, Greninja with Cyrus is so strong. And like I said, not many people playing Hitmonlee, not many people playing Zipstrika. So it ended up winning this week's competition and this weekend's tournaments. But yeah, we don't have to change a lot about Gyarados. You can comment below. I'd love to hear your opinions about how you would update these decks, but I think really just the inclusion of Cyrus and Gyarados is a massive buff in its own right. There's not much else to change about this deck. There's not a lot of room. I think we have to run Leaf. I think we have to probably run one copy of Misty's at least. Even though Gyarados isn't really reliant on Misty's, it doesn't really matter if we're playing it or not. So maybe we even cut Misty, which could be kind of crazy to think about. Yeah, I think Cyrus makes this deck a whole lot better. Again, I wanted to include Gyarados, even though it's not really changed very much. It's still an extremely strong deck, and I think Cyrus does make it a lot better. Okay, so next up, we're going to take a look at Exeggutor. So one of the sort of, I guess, rogue or, maybe sort of, I guess, lesser meta contenders of last format, which always had a very phenomenal win rate, but didn't necessarily have a lot of people playing it, was basically Exeggutor-focused grass decks that incorporated things like Tauros or Celebi or Mew EX, and weren't running Jungle Totem, right? So there was two different ways to play Celebi or grass or Exeggutor decks. The first prominently being, Celebi with Jungle Totem and Exeggutor, which we'll also take a look at in this video, spoiler, but the other way to play Exeggutor was kind of just a straight focused Exeggutor deck, which I think now is actually better than ever before, due to, again, a variety of different inclusions in a deck like this. We have Pokemon communications to, again, help us find our Exeggutor EXs that much more consistently. Also, the small Exeggutor, again, increasing the odds that we're able to evolve at least into a Exeggutor early enough in the game. That's the only reason I think why we run the small Exeggutor is because it's just better than an Execute. So no, it's not as good as Exeggutor EX, but at least it's better than no Exeggutor. So, we can only run 2 copies of the EX, so why not run sort of the small version? But Pokemon Communications making our way to find Exeggutor even easier and even more consistently, which I think, again, is a massive buff to Exeggutor. It's one of the strongest cards in the entire game. Grass type is actually better than it's ever been before with all the Darkrai decks running around. We can run Ericas. Basically, the combination of Ericas and the massive HP of Exeggutor kind of makes it a perfect counter to Darkrai decks, even though a lot of times Darkrai decks are maybe leading off with Druddigon or maybe a Pokemon that isn't weak to grass. It doesn't really matter. Basically, it's our ability to negate that ping damage and that extra chip damage on top of Shaman. So this is a really interesting one to take a look at. Again, we actually saw Shaman do really well. It was actually played in one of the Charizard decks that had a top placing at the Ursa Days tournament. And I don't think that's a really, I guess like I don't know. I'm not really surprised by that. The cool thing about Shaman is that it's really a really great counter to Darkrai and really all of those, chip damage decks. Darkrai doing 20 damage every turn, and basically Shaman healing for 10 damage every turn really does negate a lot of damage as the game goes on. The thing with Darkrai decks is they're able to start doing that 20 damage every turn from turn 1, and that can be really difficult to deal with unless we get a Shaman out early, and that 20 damage every turn turns into 10 damage every turn, much more manageable over a larger, longer game. So Shaman, a really great counter to Darkrai, but also, like I said, it's a grass type card, so it kind of fits nicely with Exeggutor and pairs really well with Ericas. And again, Giant Cape, another great inclusion to pair with Exeggutor. I think Exeggutor really benefits from a lot of different cards on this format, whether it's Pokecom, whether it's Giant Cape, and whether it's Shaman. I think that there's a lot of really good inclusions. I would personally like to see Exeggutor decks, or decks that are primarily focused around Exeggutor, see a little bit more play in the upcoming weeks, just because I think Exeggutor might even be one of the strongest, if not the strongest Pokemon in the game right now, in terms of a meta choice, right? With all of the Darkrai and Dark decks rolling around, basically playing an archetype that perfectly counters Darkrai is extremely valuable. Again, also, like, hitting for weakness on those dark Pokemon is massive. Like when you flip heads for 1 energy and you do 100 damage to a Darkrai is just absolutely crazy. Celebi as well, a really good backup attacking option. And the other upside here is that we are including Mew EX, which is going to help us in those Charizard matchups and even in the Gyarados matchups and in the Palkia matchups as well. So I think that playing Exeggutor and Mew EX with Shaman is extremely good. I don't even know if you really need Celebi. I know it's not a bad tempo card in its own right. Being able to just start attacking for Powerful Bloom on turn 2 is always a strong strategy. So it's a good starting option as well. It's played a little bit differently in these Exeggutor decks than in the Jungle Totem decks, where in those versions of Celebi, we're kind of using it primarily as a late game attacking option. This deck, it can kind of be used as a like a tempo card, which is pretty cool. And I think it's actually pretty good. I don't have much else to say, honestly. I really don't. I think Exeggutor is really good, and I think that it's been massively buffed, like I said, by Shaman, Pokemon Communications, and Giant Keep. Even though like this version of the deck didn't see a ton of play in the first week of competition, I still think that it's a top tier deck and deserves to see more play in my opinion. Exeggutor kind of slept on like it was early last format. It's going to end up being one of the strongest cards in the entire game. That's my opinion. But yeah, there it is. Next up, let's take a look at, what is this? Articuno. Now, a lot of people, I think this format, when it came out, were really high on, Palkia, because Palkia is the new shiny card. In a lot of ways, it is stronger and better than Articuno EX, but Articuno is still a really consistent card. It's got a lot going for it. It's actually a lot better now with Giant Cape being able to go up to 160 HP. That means we're out of range of getting KO'd by a lot of things in the format, like Gyarados, like Palkia, and a lot of different Pokemon that hit for, sizable amounts of damage here. But it's also massively buffed by Cyrus. Like the ability to do 80 damage and then put 10 damage on all of your opponent's bench Pokemon is actually a lot better now, considering the fact that we can bring up any of those Pokemon after that to the active spot with Cyrus. It makes this whole late game strategy much more consistent with Articuno. And I think pairing it with the Manaphy and Vaporeon combination, which we've seen just all over the place of this new format, it's one of the strongest new engines in the game. Basically, Oceanic Gift can just, absolutely accelerate energies at a crazy rate, and then we can move those energies to whichever we want, whether that's Articuno or Palkia EX with Washout on the Vaporeon. The other thing to think about here is that Palkia is actually a really good starting option anyway. If we're not starting with Palkia, if we're starting with Palkia and we're not starting with Manaphy, we can at least start attacking for 30 damage on our first turn. That can be really good, but for the most part, Palkia here kind of used as a late game attacking option, basically for us to kind of move out of Articuno and then finish the game with Palkia. So we got to keep that in mind as well. Giant Cape, really good inclusion for this deck, but I think that the Manaphy combination and the Vaporeon Washout combination not only really enables Palkia, but it makes Articuno a lot better as well. It's kind of up in the air whether we would rather play sort of a tempo-based Articuno deck than Palkia, but the upside to playing Palkia with Articuno or vice versa is the fact that we can Blizzard turn 1 fairly consistently with Misties, right? It's a basic Pokemon, 3 energies in its attack cost. We always have that potential to just turn 1 or turn 2 attack for Blizzard, which is going to be very, very strong no matter what. So I think Articuno is actually a lot better right now than people give it credit for. Yes, we're weak to Electric, but Giant Cape is going to hopefully protect us from those Magna Zones. And like I said, the fast-paced, really aggressive nature of this deck, as well as being a really consistent sort of tempo-based deck with Manaphy and Vaporeon, makes this deck a lot more consistent than it was before in terms of its ability to output damage, and a little bit more flexible in the late game, like I said, because of things like Giant Cape to allow us to live for longer, but also Cyrus to allow us to have a more reliable, gusting option in the mid to late game as well. So we'll have to see. Like, again, I like Articuno, I always have, but I don't know if it's better than not playing Articuno and just playing straight Palkia. So it's one of those things where Articuno is better, but I still don't know if it's better than not playing Articuno and just playing Palkia. It's kind of up in the air. They do have their own distinct advantages. And again, you don't want to play too many Pokemon in your deck. This whole combo here of the Vaporeon and Manaphy is a 6-card combo, so we don't want to play like, 10 or 12 Pokemon in our deck, right? So we kind of have to pick and choose, but I do think Articuno, which again is one of the classic decks of all time, one of the original decks right from Genetic Apex, is a lot better now than it was before, so I wanted to include it in this video. Not much else to say here, really. I mean, I just think that, the Manaphy Vaporeon combo with Cyrus and Giant Cape, all really good inclusions to Articuno, but we kind of already know what this archetype's all about. We've seen it very, very commonly in this first week of competition. We've got Celebi with Exeggutor and Jungle Totem, right? So here's the thing. I think Grass is, like I said, better than it was previously in other formats. I think that Celebi was potentially one of the strongest decks of the Mythical Island format. It was really the only archetype to win 2 Ursa Days tournaments of that 6-week format of Mythical Island. I believe it was the only deck to win 2 tournaments. I think Gyarados won, Charizard won, Mewtwo won, Pikachu won, and I think Golem won, and then Celebi won twice, right? So Celebi was one of the best, if not the best decks of last format, and now I do think that it's a lot better than it was, again, before. Very, very similar, although people now are playing one copy of Snivy, one Servine, and one Superior. Like I said, we can do that because Pokemon Communications allows us to find those evolution Pokemon a little bit more consistently. Like I said, for a lot of these decks, we want to thin out the deck as much as we possibly can to make Pokemon Communications that much more consistent, which makes the deck overall more consistent. So I think now playing one copy of the Superior line is really, really good. However, we are a little bit more, I guess, reliant on hopefully drawing to that one Snivy. Like I said, we have 5 basic Pokemon in the deck, whether we're leading off with Exeggutor or Celebi, and then maybe we don't draw into Snivy. Hopefully we pull it with a Pokeball. So that's kind of the downside to this deck particularly. Maybe we want to play 2 copies of Snivy, because if we don't get Jungle Totem out early enough, this deck can be a little bit of a struggle. But the format right now isn't as fast as you otherwise think of, that you otherwise maybe would have thought it was. It's not super explosive. It's kind of more setup and stall based with Darkrai, Bredagon, and things like that. But, you know, Giant Cape, Pokemon, really good. Pokemon Communications, really good inclusions with Exeggutor. And like I said, we can kind of stall out for long periods of time as well because we have Exeggutor EX and we have Erika's, right? So the combination of that allows us to really negate a lot of that chip damage that we get early on from those Dredagon decks or those Darkrai decks, to allow us to really kind of not mind if we don't go into Snivy super early. And like I said, we are playing 2 copies of Pokeball and 2 copies of Research either way. So 5 basic Pokemon in the deck and 3 evolution Pokemon. So the math there is a little bit more awkward than the Charizard deck, which is running, you know, 4 and 4. But either way, I do think Pokemon Communications makes this entire deck that much more consistent, which I think is a really big buff for a deck like this that is very reliant in the mid to late game to getting that Jungle Totem out. So again, very consistent here. Again, the buffs that we're getting from Pokecom and Giant Cape are very similar to how they are in other decks. Cyrus included here is interesting to me. I don't think it necessarily matters. I think Sabrina might even actually be better in Celebi still. I don't know. I mean, we are doing early damage with Exeggutor, so oftentimes our opponent will be forced out of the active spot, and then we can bring that Pokemon back up. But I think either way, like, the strategy with this deck is just kind of taking one-hit KOs late in the game with Celebi anyway. Cyrus is just, in general, kind of a better card than Sabrina. And we're not, maybe, I guess we don't have room to maybe run multiple copies of Sabrina and Cyrus, so I think for this deck, maybe just playing Cyrus is, maybe it's the better call. I don't know. I haven't necessarily tested it myself, but in general, I think that this archetype here of Jungle Totem, Celebi, and Exeggutor, one of the best decks of previous formats, is still one of the top decks right now. No, this deck doesn't love playing against Charizard, so from a meta call perspective, I don't know how good it is, but it is better than it was last format, again, because of the consistency buff with Pokecom and Giant Cape just always being a really, really strong card right now. In most decks, really. I mean, you could play Giant Cape in any deck, and it's probably going to make that deck better than it was before. But either way, it's still, we know what this deck is. It's just a little bit more consistent now. But in terms of a meta call, I actually do think Celebi is pretty good in the format right now. But if you want to learn more, I guess, about all of that, go check out our meta report video, because that's kind of where we talk about a lot of that stuff. But okay, so now let's move on to the fighting decks. So I could make an entire video in its own right about all of the new fighting decks and what the different combinations are. Fighting as an archetype is really interesting because we have so many choices, right? We have Hitmonlee and we have Marshadow. We even have Hitmonchan, as we see in this deck. We have Aerodactyl, we have the new Lucario card. We even have Gallade, and then of course we have Primeape. So there's so many different interactions and combinations of fighting cards that could be really, really, really good. This, to me, is going to be probably the best upgraded version of a deck that's centered around Aerodactyl EX. And the reason for that is because I think that Lucario and Aerodactyl actually go together extremely well in their own right. Aerodactyl is a card that we kind of want out a little bit later in the game, into the mid to late game. The other great thing about Aerodactyl is that it doesn't actually play any basic Pokemon. We play fossils, which increases the odds for us to start with Pokemon that we would rather start with, even though this deck is only running one copy of Hitmonchan. Riolu is able to jab for 20 damage, so we got to keep that in mind as well. So I don't know, this might not be the perfect deck list. It did do really well at a recent online tournament, but either way, I think Fighting Coach from Lucario buffing Aerodactyl's damage to either 100 or 120 damage is a very significant difference, especially when you combine it with something like a Hitmonchan doing some 30 damage or even 50 damage. So Hitmonchan wasn't really relevant last format. We kind of just would rather play Farfetch'd in a lot of scenarios. It had less HP, but it did more damage, but Farfetch'd isn't buffed by Fighting Coach Lucario, so now maybe we would rather play Hitmonchan so that, you know, maybe into the mid game, right, by turn 3 or turn 4 when Lucario is set up, we get a little bit more legs off of Hitmonchan. It also does have more HP in this Darkrai format. That can be a pretty big difference as well. So I don't know. I think that the main thing to talk about with this list, because again, I don't know what the perfect way to play fighting type decks are. We'll have to see as the, you know, the meta evolves and how people really build fighting decks and what ends up being a little bit more successful. But either way, if we're playing Aerodactyl or a deck that's focused around Aerodactyl, I do think Lucario is a massive improvement to that. We're playing one Sabrina, one Cyrus. So Cyrus would be extremely good in a deck where we're playing Hitmonlee especially, but Hitmonchan as well, just an aggressive, fast-paced card here. Still a really good inclusion here in the deck with Cyrus. And then, like I said, Giant Cape is going to bring Aerodactyl to 160. Any Pokemon in the game right now with 140 HP probably should be running Giant Cape, because going from 140 to 160 is a really, really big boost, and it is a really massive threshold for us to be over, right? We want to be over that 140 or 150 damage threshold, so really, really important as well. Magnezone, very, very common in the format, and Aerodactyl is weak to Electric, which is kind of a really interesting downside, or I guess one of the worst parts about Aerodactyl right now is that we are weak to Electric, and Magnezone is very common. So Giant Cape, very, very important there. But like I said, Rocky Helmet, always good in these aggro-based archetypes. So again, it kind of makes sense to play Rocky Helmet, at least one copy in a deck like this. But yeah, I mean, I think Lucario does buff fighting decks pretty considerably, no matter really what fighting decks we're playing. This deck I wanted to showcase was an Aerodactyl EX deck, which I think is probably one of the best pairings to Lucario. Whether you're playing Hitmonlee and Marshadow, or maybe not even playing Marshadow anymore, and you're just playing maybe 2 copies of Hitmonlee, we'll have to see. One thing to note, though, that I have been thinking about is that I don't think Marshadow in this format is nearly as good as it otherwise was. I think a lot of people are excited by the fact that Marshadow can do 120 or even 140 damage when you're buffed by Fighting Coach Lucario, but here's the thing. And I'm going to explain this, I guess, my thoughts. I'm not, I guess, positive if this is the case, but this is just my opinion and the way I feel about how this format is kind of evolving, is that a lot of times our Pokemon aren't actually getting KO'd by an attack of our opponent's Pokemon. So the thing with Revenge Marshadow is that you only get the damage buff if your Pokemon last turn was KO'd by an attack of your opponent's Pokemon. Now, we have things like Darkrai, right, which can KO you with its ability. We have Druddigon, which can KO you with its ability. We have Greninja, which can KO you with its ability. And we have Rocky Helmet, which can KO you with its ability. So there's so many scenarios now where I feel like our Pokemon are just not getting KO'd by an attack. They're getting KO'd by an effect or a damage modification, which means that Marshadow isn't actually able to use the full buff from Revenge more than it, hopefully you would hope that it would, right? I just think that there's a lot of scenarios where basically have the other decks have the ability to kind of work around Marshadow, and they're not really necessarily cornered by it. And to me, that kind of makes Marshadow a lot worse in this format. I think that fighting is good, but maybe Marshadow is going to fall out of favor. I could be wrong about that. But that's just my opinion. I would love to hear your opinions about that if you comment below. I just feel like if I was going against a Marshadow deck right now and I was playing really, Druddigon or Greninja or Darkrai or maybe a Rocky Helmet deck, I feel like I could play around the Revenge attack and maybe KO, your Hitmonchan or whatever without actually having to attack the Pokemon. Because the attack has to do the killing blow, right? You can attack it and then KO it later, but like if we're not KOing, our Pokemon with an attack, then Marshadow is useless. And I think there's a lot of scenarios where that happens in the format now. So a deck like this, if I had to rebuild it in my own mind, I would maybe cut the Marshadow and play one Hitmonlee or a second Hitmonchan. The thing is with Hitmonlee is it's not buffed by Lucario. But the thing is though, we don't really care, honestly. Like, it doesn't really matter if Lucario is buffing Hitmonlee, right? Because that 30 damage to the bench Pokemon is useful no matter what. And yes, Hitmonchan does get buffed by Lucario, so maybe we want to run one copy of each. But I think in the format right now where Darkrai exists and it's just kind of sitting on the bench all the time, and in a format where Gyarados and Magikarps are still common, maybe we just go ahead and we run 2 copies of Hitmonlee. I don't know. I'm kind of just doing some theory crafting in my head about this list. I'm not trying to pick it apart. So if you're playing a deck like this, I'm not trying to down talk it. I'm just trying to think out loud as to maybe how I would play a deck like this. But either way, like I said, Lucario, very, very good. Cyrus, again, just a really good inclusion card. Giant Cape, very important to Aerodactyl, I think, right now as well. And any aggro fighting deck should be running Rocky Helmet as well. I think it's a really good damage modification. So, yeah, that's all I have to say, I guess, about this. But fighting decks in general are just so interesting, and I think it's going to be a while before we really settle on, you know, kind of a best option, right? Like a #1 fighting deck. We'll have to see. I mean, last format we never really did settle on it, right? There was like 5 or 6 different fighting archetypes that always did pretty well. The only one that ended up winning the Ursa Days tournament last format was Golem. And unfortunately, that kind of fell out of favor, but fighting was very prominent last format, and I don't really know why we wouldn't be still playing fighting. I know it's not necessarily the most exciting thing compared to maybe some of the other new archetypes, but Lucario is exceptionally good, whether we're pairing it with Hitmonchan, Marshadow, or Aerodactyl. So we got to kind of keep that in mind. Hitmonlee's still very good in the format, but yeah, Lucario and fighting decks have been honestly buffed. I mean, I think fighting in general has been a lot better than it is better now than it was before, even though it hasn't seen as much representation in week 1, but I think that it should. I really do think so. And now here is something that has been absolutely taking over the metagame here since basically that Ursa Days tournament, over the last basically 2 days. It's Wednesday as I record this, so I think over Monday and Tuesday and now into Wednesday, a lot of people are moving towards a deck like this, and I really like it. I know we just spent a lot of time talking about Lucario and how it makes fighting decks better, but just because we are not playing Lucario doesn't mean fighting decks aren't worth running, and that's why we're playing a deck like this. So we've seen the impact that Magnezone has in a format like this. Magnezone is an independent card. You can play it in basically any deck in the format right now. I think we're going to see Magnezone played so many different ways, but the combination of the electric type attack from Magnezone, being able to hit for weakness on those water type decks, while combining with that really aggressive fighting deck strategy with Hitmonlee, Hitmonchan, and Marshadow, allows us to really have 2 really good strategies that are, one is really fast paced and in your face and consistent, and the other one is a really consistent mid to late game attacker that we don't ever really have to, you know, bother attaching energies to. So in a deck like this, of course, we would be running exclusively fighting type energies, but we have an electric type attacker, which is going to be really good, because again, I think water decks are still predominantly one of the most common archetypes in the entire game right now. And yes, we're able to play Pokemon Communications. That makes Magnezone much better than it would have been if we did have Pokemon Communications, and we also are able to run Cyrus. Like I said, I think, like I said, even though Lucario isn't buffing Hitmonlee, I don't think that makes it, or should be a reason why we don't play Hitmonlee. I think that Hitmonlee in this format right now is still absolutely phenomenal, considering how much Druddigon and Darkrai is running around, and how many Gyaradoses are probably going to be running around still in this format. But also, Cyrus makes it that much better. Basically, we can tag, from turn 1, we can tag any Pokemon we want with the Stretch Kick attack from Hitmonlee, and then later in the game bring it up to take a KO with Magnezone or even Marshadow. So Cyrus with Hitmonlee is such a good combination. This deck is honestly kind of perfect in a lot of different scenarios. It may seem a little bit awkward, but like I said, the Hitmonlee Marshadow combo is still really good, even though I think Hitmonlee is a little bit less consistent right now, but our Marshadow is a little bit less consistent right now, but Hitmonlee and Cyrus makes it that much better. I mean, I really do think Hitmonlee is a really good pick into this current format. That's really my opinion. But like I said, we're going to see so many different Magnezone decks and so many different fighting decks. That's one of the things that I really love about this format. This doesn't seem like an upgraded deck, but it is, right? This is the aggro Hitmonlee Marshadow package in a way that is kind of an anti-meta pick and upgraded with Cyrus and Pokemon Communication. So I really like this version of this deck particularly. But anyway, guys, that's going to be it. We're going to wrap up the video like that. I didn't include some stuff, like I didn't include like Blastoise or Venusaur, but the thing is though, like the format is still so early right now that I know that there's a lot of decks that I didn't include as upgraded decks in this video. I didn't include Mewtwo and things like that, but a lot of the decks really haven't changed, and you can apply the principles that we've taken and talked about in this video to a lot of those other decks. The reason I didn't include some things that maybe you might be questioning or asking about is just because it hasn't really seen play, right? So I don't really want to talk about something if it hasn't had success or hasn't seen play from a competitive standpoint, because here on the channel, I like to talk about, you know, the best decks, right? And the best, you know, strategies that you should be playing in the game right now. And if something isn't really successful or if it's not seeing play, there's probably a reason for that. But if you wanted to, again, you know, upgrade your Mewtwo deck or your Dragonite deck or your Blastoise or your, you know, Venusaur deck, then, you know, go ahead and apply a lot of the principles that we talked about in this video to whatever old archetype that you want to upgrade. And I think that you can, I think that'll go a long way. And I think that really you can upgrade any old deck in the game right now. But I didn't want to talk much, forever, I guess. And again, I only really wanted to talk about things that were necessarily relevant in the current metagame. So anyway, guys, that's going to be the video. Like I said, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. The support has been phenomenal, and I really, really do appreciate it, guys. So if you're new to the channel, or if you're not new to the channel but you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. It would mean a lot to me. And comment below, what decks that maybe I didn't talk about today that you think have been upgraded or updated and are a lot better now than they were previously. I would love to hear your guys' opinions. It's really fun to talk to you guys in the comments. So yeah, go ahead and do that. But anyway, let's get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys next time. And yeah, later.